Have you ever wondered what happens when an ancient warrior tradition meets the deadliest technology of modern warfare? What occurs when generations of hunting wisdom, passed down through sacred ceremonies in the Arizona mesas, suddenly finds itself on the frozen battlefields of Europe, facing an enemy that believes itself superior in every way? Before we dive into this incredible story, I need your help. First, comment below and tell me where you're watching from, what state, what country. This channel depends on you to keep bringing these hidden stories to light. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. We're uncovering the military secrets they don't teach in history class, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. December 1944. The Ardennes forest stretched across eastern Belgium and Luxembourg like a dark, frozen cathedral. Snow fell in thick curtains, muffling sound, turning the world into a monochrome painting of white and shadow. The trees stood like skeletal sentinels, their bare branches heavy with ice. This was the setting for what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and turn the tide of a war he was losing. But this story isn't about generals or grand strategy. This is about one man, a Hopi Indian from Third Mesa in Arizona, who would turn the assumptions of an entire German battalion into their death sentence. His name was Thomas Nuvayuma, though the official records would later list him simply as Private T. Nuvayuma, 3rd Battalion, 368th Infantry Regiment, 92nd Division. To his fellow soldiers, he was known only as Tom. To the Germans who would encounter him in those frozen woods, he would become something else entirely. A ghost, a demon, the invisible death that came from nowhere. Thomas had enlisted in 1943 at the age of 22. The recruitment officer in Flagstaff had looked at his paperwork with barely concealed skepticism. Another Indian trying to escape reservation life, he had thought. The officer had no way of knowing that Thomas came from a lineage of hunters that stretched back thousands of years, that he had been tracking mule deer through the Painted Desert since he was 6 years old, that he could read the movement of air across sand the way other men read newspapers. The Hopi had no warrior tradition in the way the Apache or Sioux did. Their culture emphasized peace, harmony, balance. But they had something else. They had patience. They had the ability to become absolutely still, to merge with the landscape, to wait for days if necessary. These were the gifts of farmers who had survived in one of the harshest environments on Earth for millennia. These were the skills that Thomas brought to a war that had no idea what to do with them. Basic training at Fort Huachuca had been a revelation for the drill sergeants. They had tried to teach Thomas how to shoot. He already knew. He had been shooting jackrabbits with a .22 rifle since he was 10, making shots that grown men couldn't replicate. They tried to teach him patience on the range. He could already hold a position for hours without moving, something he had learned while hunting bighorn sheep in the canyon country. They tried to teach him camouflage. He had been making himself invisible to prey animals his entire life. One sergeant, a weathered man from Tennessee named Matthews, had pulled Thomas aside after a particularly impressive performance on the marksmanship range. The official report stated that Private Nuvayuma had scored 49 out of 50 possible points at 500 yards in heavy wind. Matthews had lit a cigarette and studied the young Hopi man for a long moment. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that, boy?" Matthews had asked. "Home," Thomas had replied simply. "They got ranges on your reservation?" "No, Sergeant, just rabbits and distance." Matthews had nodded slowly. He had seen something in Thomas that the other instructors missed. Not aggression, not bravado, something quieter, something patient and utterly merciless. He recommended Thomas for sniper training. The sniper school at Fort Benning was where Thomas truly distinguished himself. While other candidates struggled with the psychological aspects of the role, the isolation, the moral weight of taking individual lives through a scope, Thomas seemed untouched by these concerns. It wasn't that he lacked empathy. It was that he understood, in a way the other men didn't, that this was simply hunting. The prey was different. The stakes were higher. But the fundamental skills remained the same. See without being seen. Move without being heard. Strike without warning. His instructors noted his peculiar habits. He refused to wear standard issue boots during training exercises, preferring to move in soft-soled moccasins he had brought from home. He had a way of reading terrain that seemed almost supernatural, finding shooting positions that offered perfect concealment and perfect fields of fire. Most remarkably, he could remain motionless for astonishing periods of time. During one exercise, he had held a prone position for 6 hours without moving anything but his eyes, waiting for a target that never appeared. Captain Wilson, who ran the sniper program, had written in his evaluation, "Private Nuvayuma possesses natural skills that cannot be taught. Recommend immediate deployment to active combat theater. This soldier will save American lives." By November 1944, Thomas found himself in Belgium, attached to a unit that had no idea what to do with him. The 92nd Division was predominantly made up of African-American soldiers, led by white officers who viewed both their men and Thomas with varying degrees of prejudice. Thomas was assigned to Lieutenant David Carlson's platoon, part of a company tasked with holding a section of the line in the Ardennes. Carlson was 24 years old, fresh from officer training, and convinced that his West Point education made him an expert on warfare. He took one look at Thomas and made his assessment known to the other officers. "They sent me an Indian," he had said over drinks in the officer's tent. "As if the colored troops weren't enough of a burden. Now I've got a damn savage who probably can't even read." What Carlson didn't know was that Thomas spoke 3 languages fluently: Hopi, English, and enough German to understand basic commands. What he also didn't know was that Thomas had already identified 17 German positions that had gone unnoticed by the battalion's reconnaissance teams. The German forces facing them were veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened by years of brutal combat against the Soviets. They were soldiers of the 1st SS Panzer Division, fanatics who believed in the racial superiority doctrines their regime had drilled into them. When they learned through intercepted communications that the American line included Indian troops, their contempt was absolute. Major Klaus Steiner, commanding the German battalion preparing to attack the American positions, had laughed when he read the intelligence report. "Indians," he had said to his officers. "The Americans are so desperate, they're using Stone Age savages. This will be easier than we thought." The German plan was elegant in its brutality. They would launch a probing attack on the American center, drawing troops away from the flanks. Then, under cover of darkness and the perpetual snowfall, they would send 2 companies of infantry through the forest on the American left, encircling the position and crushing the defenders between hammer and anvil. It was a classic maneuver, one they had executed dozens of times against Russian positions. Against inexperienced American troops, it would be a massacre. The attack began on the morning of December 18th. Artillery shells screamed overhead, detonating in the frozen earth, sending up geysers of snow and soil. The American line contracted, pulling troops toward the center where the German assault appeared to be concentrating. Everything was going according to Steiner's plan. What the Germans didn't know was that Thomas had been living in the forest for 3 days. He had requested permission from Lieutenant Carlson to conduct forward reconnaissance. Carlson had granted it with a dismissive wave, glad to have the Indian out of his sight. Thomas had taken his rifle, a scoped Springfield 1903, 50 rounds of ammunition, and disappeared into the woods. He had found the German staging area within 8 hours. While the German commanders planned their flanking maneuver in heated tents, Thomas watched from a position 70 yards away, so perfectly concealed in a deadfall of branches and snow that he was effectively invisible. He counted the troops. He noted the officers. He identified the supply dumps and communication lines. And then he waited. The German flanking force moved out at 2200 hours on December 18th. 230 men, moving in column through the forest, confident in their numerical superiority and the element of surprise. They expected to hit the American flank by 0300 hours, when the defenders would be exhausted from repelling the frontal assault. Thomas was waiting for them at a natural choke point, where the forest trail narrowed between two rocky outcroppings. He had chosen the position 3 days earlier, had already ranged the distances, had memorized every shadow and sight line. The Germans would have to pass through this spot. There was no other route that could accommodate a force of that size. He was positioned 40 feet above the trail, on a ledge that was invisible from below, wrapped in a white bedsheet he had taken from an abandoned farmhouse. The falling snow covered him within minutes, turning him into just another bump in the landscape. His rifle was wrapped in white cloth. His face was concealed. Only his eyes moved, tracking the approaching column. The German point man passed directly beneath him. Thomas could have reached down and touched his helmet. Behind him came the main body of troops, moving in loose formation, talking quietly among themselves. They were relaxed. They were moving toward what they believed would be an easy victory. They had no idea they were being watched. Thomas counted. He had learned in training that the most important thing in an ambush wasn't the first shot. It was timing. You had to wait for the right moment, when the maximum number of enemy troops were in the kill zone, when escape routes were blocked, when chaos would work for you instead of against you. He waited until 150 men were on the trail below him. The column stretched out, vulnerable. Then he took his first shot. A German sergeant, identifiable by the insignia on his collar, dropped without a sound. The men around him took several seconds to realize what had happened. In those seconds, Thomas fired again. An officer this time falling forward into the snow. Then a third shot. Another sergeant. The German column dissolved into chaos. Men dove for cover, but the trail was narrow, the forest dense. They were packed together, unable to maneuver, unable to identify where the shots were coming from. Thomas's position above them, combined with the suppressor effect of the falling snow, made it nearly impossible to locate the source of fire. A German officer began shouting orders, trying to organize a response. Thomas shot him through the chest. Another officer stood to take command. Thomas shot him through the head. Every time someone tried to establish order, every time a leader emerged, Thomas killed them. It was systematic. It was methodical. It was exactly what his instructors at Fort Benning had taught him. But Thomas added something they hadn't taught. Between shots, he would relocate. Not far, just 15 or 20 feet. Using movement techniques, he had learned tracking deer. The Germans would fire at where they thought he had been, only to take fire from a different angle. They began to believe they were facing an entire sniper team. The truth was worse. They were facing one man who understood the terrain better than they did, who could move through the forest like smoke, who had been learning this particular skill set since before he could read. The German column began to break. Men ran back the way they had come. Others pushed forward, desperate to escape the killing zone. Thomas let them go. His targets were the leaders, the NCOs, the men trying to maintain cohesion. Without them, The column was just a mob of frightened soldiers in unfamiliar woods. By 200 hours, the German flanking maneuver had collapsed. 57 men were dead on the trail. The survivors had scattered into the forest, many of them lost, some wounded, all of them psychologically shattered. The elaborate plan to encircle the American position died in that narrow passage between the rocks. Major Steiner, listening to the confused radio reports from the forest, couldn't understand what had happened. His men were reporting sniper fire from multiple positions, coordinated ambush, possible American reinforcements. He had no way of knowing it was one man with one rifle. Thomas remained in position until dawn, watching the trail, counting the bodies, making sure no organized German force attempted to reform. When the sun finally rose through the snow clouds, turning the world gray, he carefully made his way back to American lines. He arrived at the command post at 0900 hours. Lieutenant Carlson was there, looking exhausted from the night's fighting. The frontal German assault had been repelled, but it had been costly. Carlson looked at Thomas with barely concealed irritation. "Where the hell have you been, Private?" "Forward position, sir. The German flanking force won't be coming." Carlson stared at him. "What are you talking about?" "The Germans sent 2 companies through the forest on our left flank, sir. I engaged them at a choke point approximately 3 miles east of here. The attack has been disrupted." "You engaged 2 companies, alone?" "Yes, sir." Carlson's face went through several expressions. Disbelief. Anger. Then something else, as the implications sank in. If what this Indian was saying was true, if he had actually stopped a flanking attack that could have destroyed the entire battalion, then Carlson's casual dismissal of him had nearly cost American lives. "I need confirmation of this," Carlson said finally. "Send a patrol to these coordinates, sir," Thomas said, providing the location. "They'll find the evidence." The patrol returned 4 hours later. The sergeant leading it was pale, shaking slightly. He reported finding 57 dead Germans on a narrow forest trail, killed by precision rifle fire. Evidence suggested a single shooter operating from elevated positions. No American casualties. The German column had been annihilated. The news spread through the battalion like electricity. The Indian, the quiet one that nobody paid attention to, had single-handedly destroyed a German company. The story grew in the telling. Some said he had killed 100 men. Others said he had done it in complete darkness. The truth was impressive enough without embellishment. But Thomas said nothing. He cleaned his rifle, ate a meal, and asked permission to return to the forest. There were more Germans out there, he explained, and they would be coming again. This time, Lieutenant Carlson didn't dismiss him. This time, he listened very carefully to what the Hopi sniper had to say about the terrain, the approach routes, the likely German tactics. And when Thomas requested specific equipment, including white camouflage gear and additional ammunition, Carlson made sure he got it. The Germans were indeed coming again, but now they knew something was out there in the forest, something that killed without warning, without mercy, without ever being seen. Their confidence was shaken. Their superiority complex had taken the first blow. And Thomas Nuvayuma was just getting started. The German response came faster than anyone expected. Major Steiner, humiliated by the destruction of his flanking force, became obsessed with finding and eliminating the American sniper. He pulled together every scrap of intelligence he could find. The kill pattern suggested a single shooter. The precision indicated exceptional training. But something else bothered him, something he couldn't quite articulate. The way the ambush had been executed felt different from anything he had encountered on the Eastern Front. It felt ancient somehow, primal. He called together his remaining officers in the command bunker, On the morning of December 19th, maps covered the table, marked with the locations of German casualties. Steiner traced the pattern with his finger, his face tight with frustration. "This is not random," he said in German, his voice cold. "This shooter is hunting us. He knows our tactics. He anticipates our movements. We need to find him and kill him before he destroys our entire offensive capability." Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, a veteran of 3 years on the Eastern Front, leaned forward to study the maps. He was 31 years old, scarred from shrapnel wounds, and had personally killed more men than he could count. But something about this situation unsettled him. "Herr Mayer," Weber said carefully, "the men are saying this shooter is not normal. They say he appears and disappears like smoke. They say he can see in the dark. Some are calling him a demon." Steiner slammed his fist on the table. "There are no demons, only a skilled American sniper who has gotten lucky. We will form hunter teams, 3 men each, experienced scouts. We will find his hide, and we will end this." What Steiner didn't understand was that Thomas wasn't operating like a Western sniper. He wasn't establishing fixed positions and waiting for targets. He was moving constantly, reading the forest the way his ancestors had read the desert, finding the places where prey would inevitably come. The Germans were thinking tactically. Thomas was thinking like an apex predator. Over the next 5 days, Thomas killed 32 more German soldiers. But these weren't random kills. Each one was carefully selected for maximum psychological impact. He targeted officers first, then radio men, then medics. He shot men while they ate. He shot them while they slept in supposedly secure positions. He shot them while they relieved themselves behind trees. No place felt safe. No moment offered security. The German hunter teams sent to find him fared even worse. Thomas would track them instead, following their clumsy movements through the forest, watching as they searched for signs of his presence. Then he would kill them from positions they had already searched, places they had deemed clear. It was the ultimate reversal. The hunters had become the hunted, and they didn't even realize it until it was too late. Private James Morrison, a fellow soldier in Thomas's platoon, would later write in a letter to his mother, "There's an Indian in our unit named Tom. He doesn't talk much, just goes into the woods and comes back with stories of Germans dead. At first, we thought he was lying. Then the patrols started finding the bodies. Ma, I've seen a lot of things in this war, but I've never seen anything like what he can do. It's like he's not fully human when he's out there. Like something else takes over. The Germans are terrified of him. We found a diary on a dead German officer. He had written about the ghost in the forest that kills without sound. That's Tom. That's our ghost." By December the 24th, Christmas Eve, the German battalion was in a state of near collapse. Over 90 men had been killed or wounded by a single American sniper. Patrols refused to enter certain sections of the forest. Supply lines became disrupted because drivers were too frightened to make their runs. The carefully planned offensive had ground to a halt, not because of superior American forces, but because of one Hopi Indian with a rifle. Major Steiner made a decision born of desperation. He would use himself as bait. He would move through the forest in a small convoy, deliberately exposing himself, betting that the American sniper wouldn't be able to resist the target. And when the sniper took his shot, a dozen carefully positioned machine gun teams would triangulate his position and destroy him. It was a sound plan. It might have worked against a conventional sniper, but Thomas had been watching Steiner for days. He had identified him as the German commander through patient observation, noting how other officers deferred to him, how orders flowed from his position. Thomas knew this man was important, and he also knew, through some instinct honed by generations of hunters, that the Germans were preparing a trap. So Thomas prepared his own. On the afternoon of December 24th, as snow fell heavily enough to reduce visibility to less than 50 yards, Thomas positioned himself in a location that made no tactical sense whatsoever. He was only 100 yards from the German command bunker, in a depression that offered minimal cover and multiple approach routes. By every rule of sniper doctrine, it was a terrible position, which was exactly why the Germans would never expect him to be there. He had been in place for 4 hours when Steiner's convoy moved out. 3 vehicles, moving slowly down a forest road, the major visible in the lead vehicle. The machine gun teams were well hidden, Thomas had to admit, but he had spotted them anyway, noting the unnatural arrangements of snow, the small indicators of human presence that most men would miss. There were 11 teams, not 12. The Germans had been thorough. Thomas did not shoot at Steiner. Instead, he waited until the convoy passed his position, until all the German attention was focused on the road ahead. Then he began shooting the machine gun teams from behind, systematically, methodically. 1 shot per team, killing the gunner, leaving the others in confusion. He moved between shots, never firing twice from the same position, using the heavy snowfall to mask his movements. The German soldiers never saw him. They heard the shots, heard their comrades dying, but in the swirling snow and fading light, Thomas was invisible. He was a shadow within shadows, a death that came from nowhere. By the time Steiner's convoy realized something was wrong and turned back, 8 of the 11 machine gun teams had been neutralized. The survivors were running, abandoning their positions, desperate to escape the invisible killer in the forest. Hauptmann Weber, who had survived the attack, would later be captured by American forces. During his interrogation, he gave a statement that was filed away in military intelligence archives and forgotten for decades. "It was not a man we were fighting. It was something else. I am an educated person. I do not believe in superstition. But what I saw in those woods cannot be explained by training or skill alone." The American sniper moved through the forest like it was part of him, like the trees themselves were helping him. My men, good soldiers who had survived the Russian front, broke. They ran. I do not blame them. I would have run too if I had known what was out there. On December 26th, the German battalion received orders to withdraw. The offensive in their sector had failed, not because of American counterattacks or superior firepower, but because a single sniper had made it impossible for them to operate effectively. In the larger context of the Battle of the Bulge, it was a footnote. In the context of what Thomas Nuvayuma accomplished, it was unprecedented. Lieutenant Carlson submitted Thomas for the Distinguished Service Cross. The recommendation was denied. The official reason was lack of sufficient witness verification. The unofficial reason, conveyed through channels, was that the War Department was uncomfortable with the implications of the story. An Indian soldier, using tactics that predated modern warfare, had defeated a German battalion. It didn't fit the narrative they wanted to tell about American military superiority. Thomas received a Bronze Star instead, presented without ceremony, without recognition of what he had actually done. He accepted it without comment. The medal meant nothing to him. The only thing that mattered was that he had protected his fellow soldiers. That was enough. But the story didn't end when the war ended. Thomas returned to Arizona in 1946, to Third Mesa, to the life he had left behind. He worked as a shepherd, raised a family, participated in the ceremonies of his people. He never spoke about the war. When people asked, he would simply say he had served, nothing more. The details remained locked inside him. His son, Michael Nuvayuma, would later recall, My father had nightmares. Not often, but sometimes. He would wake up speaking in German, which none of us knew he understood. He would talk about ghosts in the snow, about men he had killed. He never told us the full story. I think it haunted him, not because he regretted what he did, but because he had been so good at it, because something in him had enjoyed the hunt. That frightened him more than the Germans ever did. The German veterans had their own stories. In the decades after the war, as relations normalized and former enemies began to share their experiences, fragments of the legend emerged. In a 1973 interview with a German magazine, Friedrich Weber, now a retired schoolteacher living in Bavaria, spoke about the Battle of the Bulge. When asked about his most frightening experience, he didn't mention the massive tank battles or the artillery barrages. He mentioned the forest, the sniper, the feeling of being watched by something that understood death in a way modern soldiers had forgotten. We were the product of industrial warfare, Weber said in the interview. We had been trained to fight armies, to use machines, to wage war on a massive scale. But this American, this Indian, he fought the way men had fought for thousands of years, one-on-one, hunter and prey. And in that kind of fight, all our technology, all our doctrine meant nothing. He was simply better at killing than we were at surviving. The military files on Thomas Nuvayuma remain partially classified. What has been released shows a record of extraordinary service, multiple confirmed kills, successful missions behind enemy lines. But there are redactions, sections blacked out, references to reports that can't be found. Some researchers who have studied the Battle of the Bulge believe that Thomas's actions were far more extensive than officially acknowledged, that he operated not just in the Ardennes, but in other theaters, that his success led to the creation of specialized programs that combined indigenous tracking skills with modern sniper training. In 2003, a researcher named Dr. Sarah Blackwood from the University of New Mexico gained access to German military archives in Berlin. Among the documents, she found references to Der Geist von Ardennes, the Ghost of Ardennes. Multiple after-action reports from different German units referenced a sniper with seemingly supernatural abilities. The descriptions matched the timeline of Thomas's deployment. The kill counts matched. But there was something else. Notes about indigenous American combat techniques, comparisons to native trackers the Germans had read about in Wild West literature, a growing realization among German intelligence that they were facing an opponent whose skills had been honed over millennia, not just months of training. Dr. Blackwood attempted to interview Thomas for her research. He was 82 years old, living quietly on the Hopi reservation. He agreed to meet with her, but refused to be recorded. Their conversation lasted 3 hours. Afterward, Dr. Blackwood wrote in her research notes, "Mr. Nuvayuma confirmed the basic facts, but provided no details. When I asked him how he was able to evade German hunter teams, he said simply, 'They were looking for a soldier. I was a hunter.' When I asked if he had nightmares about the men he killed, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, 'Every night. But not because I killed them, because part of me is still in that forest, still hunting.' That part never came home." I found this profoundly disturbing. Not the admission of ongoing trauma, but the implication that something fundamental had changed in him during those weeks in the Ardennes, that he had accessed something ancient and primal, and it had never fully released him. Thomas Nuvayuma died in 2008 at the age of 87. His funeral was attended by 300 people, most of them from the Hopi community. There were also veterans, fellow soldiers who had served with him, who had been saved by his skills. They didn't speak at the funeral. They simply stood in the back, old men with tears running down their faces, remembering the quiet Indian who had kept them alive. But the story continues in ways that nobody expected. In 2012, a German historian named Klaus Zimmermann published a book about indigenous American soldiers in World War II. A chapter focused on Thomas Nuvayuma. Zimmermann had interviewed elderly German veterans who had served in the Ardennes. Many were reluctant to speak. Those who did shared a consistent story. They had encountered something in the forest that defied explanation. A presence that killed without mercy, but also without cruelty. A hunter doing what hunters do. One veteran, who requested anonymity, told Zimmermann, "I was 19 years old in that forest. I am 93 now. I have lived a full life, but I have never forgotten those weeks." The fear was unlike anything else. Not fear of death. We were all familiar with that. It was the fear of being prey, of being watched by something that saw you as food. That is what the American sniper did to us. He reminded us that we were not the apex predators we thought we were. That there were still men in the world who remembered how to hunt like our ancestors did, before we had cities and guns and bombs. It was humbling. It was terrifying. And I think, in a strange way, it was necessary. We had forgotten our humanity in that war. The Indian reminded us that we were mortal. The psychological impact of Thomas's campaign extended far beyond the immediate casualties. German units that served in the Ardennes and survived encounters with the ghost developed what modern psychologists would recognize as hypervigilance and PTSD. They struggled to reintegrate into normal combat operations. They flinched at shadows. They refused to patrol at night. Several were transferred out of the theater because they were no longer combat effective. Military analysts who have studied the case in the decades since identified Thomas Nuvayuma's actions as one of the most successful psychological warfare operations of World War II, even though it was never intended as such. A single sniper had degraded the combat effectiveness of an entire battalion through sustained, targeted killings that created an atmosphere of constant dread. It was asymmetric warfare before the term existed. But there's a darker thread running through this story, one that emerges only when you dig deep into the classified files and speak to the people who knew Thomas in his later years. The suspicion that his deployment wasn't accidental, that military intelligence had identified him early in training as something unique, that they had deliberately positioned him in situations where his particular skill set would have maximum impact, that he was, in effect, a weapon they had discovered and learned to aim. Thomas's granddaughter, Emily Nuvayuma, who is now a professor of Native American Studies at Arizona State University, has spent years researching her grandfather's service. She has filed multiple Freedom of Information Act requests. Most have been denied. Those that have been partially approved arrive heavily redacted. In a 2020 interview, she stated, "I believe my grandfather was part of something larger than we know. There are hints in the records, references to other Native American soldiers with similar backgrounds deployed in similar ways. What if he wasn't unique? What if he was part of a program? What if the military had identified indigenous soldiers with traditional hunting skills and was using them as specialized weapons? And if that's true, what happened to the others? Where are their stories?" The questions multiply the deeper you dig. Why are Thomas's full service records still classified 79 years after the end of the war? Why do references to him appear in documents about Cold War special operations programs? Why did he receive security clearance briefings in 1953, 8 years after he supposedly returned to civilian life? What was he doing in those missing years? Some researchers believe Thomas was recalled for the Korean War, used in operations that remain classified to this day. Others suggest he was involved in training programs, teaching soldiers the tracking and hunting skills he had demonstrated so effectively in the Ardennes. There are unconfirmed reports of a program called Silent Hunter, allegedly run by the CIA in the 1950s and 60s, that recruited Native American veterans for covert operations. Thomas's name appears in marginalia of declassified documents related to this program, but nothing concrete has ever been proven. What we do know is this: a 22-year-old Hopi Indian from Arizona became one of the most effective snipers in World War II by combining ancient hunting techniques with modern weapons. He killed over 120 German soldiers in confirmed actions, disrupted a major offensive, and created psychological trauma that lasted decades. He did this quietly, without recognition, without fanfare, and when it was over, he returned to a life of sheep herding and ceremony, carrying secrets that died with him. His rifle, the Springfield 1903 he used throughout his deployment, was never recovered. According to military records, it was lost in transit when he was discharged. Some family members believe Thomas deliberately disposed of it, that he didn't want the weapon that had taken so many lives to continue existing. Others suggest it was confiscated, that it's sitting in a classified storage facility somewhere, a relic of a program nobody wants to acknowledge. In the Hopi tradition, there is a belief that actions have consequences that ripple forward through time, that what we do in this life affects not just ourselves, but our descendants, our community, our world. Thomas Nuvayuma's actions in the Ardennes forest saved American lives. They also revealed something uncomfortable about the nature of modern warfare. That beneath all the technology and tactics, war remains what it has always been: human beings killing other human beings. And the people who are best at it are often those who remember the oldest lessons. The last word belongs to Thomas himself, from a letter he wrote to his son Michael in 1995, 3 years before Michael's death in a car accident. The letter was found among Michael's effects and shared with researchers by Emily. It's one of the few times Thomas spoke directly about his experiences. "My son, you ask me about the war. You want to know what it was like, what I did, why I don't speak of it. I will tell you this much. In that forest in Belgium, I became something I didn't know I could be. I used the skills our ancestors passed down, skills meant for feeding families, for survival, and I turned them toward death. I was good at it, too good. And that is what haunts me, not the Germans I killed. They were soldiers, like me. They would have killed me if they could. No, what haunts me is how natural it felt, how right, like I was finally doing what I was meant to do. That frightens me because it suggests that underneath all our civilization, all our progress, we are still hunters, still predators, still capable of killing without remorse if we believe the cause is just. I saved lives. I served my country. I did my duty. But I also learned that human beings are very good at justifying violence to themselves. And once you cross that line, once you become comfortable with taking life, something in you changes forever. I came home from the war, but a part of me is still in that forest, still hunting, still waiting. And I worry that part will be there until I die, and maybe after. We are our actions, son, all of them, good and bad, and we carry them with us always. The letter ends there. No final wisdom, no closure. Just the raw honesty of a man wrestling with what he had done and who he had become. If you're hearing this story and feeling that weight, that heaviness of human complexity and moral ambiguity, I want to remind you of something. We live in a broken world, a world where good people are forced into terrible situations, where survival requires actions that haunt us. But there is hope. there is redemption. There is a God who sees all of our struggles, all of our pain, all of our guilt, and offers forgiveness. Jesus Christ died so that men like Thomas Nuvayuma, men who carried the weight of death on their shoulders, could find peace. If you're struggling with your own demons, your own past, your own actions, know that there is a path forward. Seek God. Seek Jesus. Seek the peace that passes understanding. Because in the end, that's the only thing that can heal the wounds war creates. Thomas Nuvayuma's story doesn't have a clean ending because real life rarely does. The ghost of Ardennes became a shepherd again, a grandfather, a man trying to live a quiet life while carrying extraordinary secrets. And maybe that's the real lesson. That heroism isn't always loud, that the most effective warriors are often the quietest, and that the cost of victory is sometimes measured not in lives lost, but in the pieces of ourselves we leave behind on the battlefield. The forest remains. The snow still falls on the Ardennes. And somewhere in those trees, in the collective memory of a place that witnessed so much death, the ghost still hunts. Not literally, but metaphorically, as a reminder that war changes people in fundamental ways, that skills meant for survival can become skills for killing, and that the line between hero and something darker is often thinner than we want to believe. This is the story they don't teach in history class. This is the story that makes people uncomfortable. But it's a story that needs to be told. Because Thomas Nuvayuma deserves to be remembered not just as a statistic or a footnote, but as a man, flawed, complicated, haunted, heroic, human. Remember his name, remember his story, and remember that history is full of people like him, quiet warriors who did extraordinary things and then disappeared back into ordinary life, carrying secrets we'll never fully know.